A brisk autumn wind tugged at Rick Holloway's jacket as he stepped onto the cracked pavement outside the Starview Cinemas in Glendale. He took a steadying breath. The neon sign above the entrance buzzed faintly, flickering between vibrant red and tired dullness, much like his faith in this business. For years, he had built Starview with the belief that a great movie experience wasn't just about blockbusters and buttery popcorn. It was about people. Employees who felt valued. Customers who felt at home. But something had gone wrong. Reports of slipping customer service and internal complaints had reached his office, the kind that couldn't be ignored. A whistleblower email about unpaid wages had landed in his inbox weeks ago, followed by rumors of toxic management. When he had pressed for answers, his district supervisors had given him canned responses. "We're handling it. Nothing to worry about." But Rick didn't trust empty reassurances. He wanted to see it with his own eyes. Now, with a pair of thick-rimmed glasses on his nose, his hair intentionally left unkempt, and dressed in a faded hoodie and scuffed sneakers, he was Greg Willis, a new hire, minimum wage, bottom of the chain. No one would look at him twice. Pushing open the glass door, he was hit by the familiar scent of buttered popcorn and the artificial chill of an overworked air conditioning unit. The lobby gleamed under fluorescent lights, but the forced cheerfulness of the decor couldn't mask the underlying tension in the air. A man in his early 40s stood near the concession stand, barking orders at a frazzled employee balancing a tray of drinks. "Pick up the pace, Lisa. Customers don't wait." His voice was sharp, edged with the kind of authority that wasn't earned but imposed. Brad Wilkins, general manager. Rick recognized him from the employee files, charismatic on paper, but something about him had always felt off. Now, watching the way Lisa flinched under his words, he felt the first real stirrings of unease. He approached the counter hesitantly. Hi, I'm Greg. New hire." Brad barely looked at him. "Right. Lisa, show him around." Then, as an afterthought, he added, "Don't waste too much time. We need hands on deck." Lisa, a young woman in her mid-20s, forced a smile despite the exhaustion shadowing her eyes. "Welcome to the team. Let's get you set up." Rick followed her past the concession stand, through a narrow hallway lined with scuffed posters of last summer's blockbusters. She handed him a uniform, a slightly faded polo with the Starview logo embroidered on the chest. "You're lucky," she said, her voice hushed as they reached the employee break room. Brad usually doesn't bother learning new hires' names. Most of them don't last long. Rick noted the weight in her words. "That bad?" Lisa hesitated, then shrugged. "You'll see." A sharp laugh echoed from the lobby as two teenage girls leaned against the counter, whispering. One, with curly brown hair, nudged the other with her elbow. "Did you hear about Rachel?" The name was barely audible, but Rick caught it. The other girl, blonde, shot a glance toward Brad, who was busy berating another employee. "Sure, Emma, you want to get fired too?" Rick turned his back, pretending to adjust his uniform, but his ears stayed trained on them. Emma's voice dipped lower. She said she was missing money from her paycheck. Asked Brad about it, and poof, gone. Carly shifted uncomfortably. "Brad told us not to talk about it. He said consequences." Rick's grip tightened around the fabric of his polo. His heart hammered against his ribs. He had come here expecting to see a lackluster work environment. Maybe some employees who were cutting corners. Managers who needed a reminder about company values. But this smelled of something far worse. Lisa returned, handing him a name tag. "Ready." Rick forced a nod, slipping the tag onto his uniform. Yeah, let's do this. But inside his mind raced. He wasn't just here to observe anymore. He was here to uncover the truth. Rick settled into his role quickly, keeping his head down and his ears open. The more he listened, the more uneasy he became. Employees moved through their shifts with the quiet resignation of people who had learned not to push back. Laughter was scarce. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Brad's presence was like a storm cloud over the theater. His booming voice controlled the floor, barking orders without care for who flinched under them. He had an uncanny ability to materialize just when someone dared to take a breath. Every interaction was laced with an undercurrent of threat, a constant reminder of who held the power. Rick caught glimpses of the smaller cruelties. Lisa stayed long after her shift ended, exhaustion weighing heavy on her limbs, but the overtime hours never made it to her paycheck. A quiet, timid usher named Miguel barely spoke above a whisper and avoided Brad's gaze like a kicked dog expecting another blow. Employees exchanged nervous glances whenever paydays approached, as if holding their breath, hoping their wages were intact this time. He hadn't imagined the whispers about Rachel. There was something deeply wrong in this theater. Late one evening, Rick found himself behind the concession stand, methodically scooping popcorn while Emma and Carly restocked candy beneath the counter. They worked efficiently, hands moving without hesitation, but their voices were hushed. "Did you see the schedule?" Carly muttered. Brad gave all the weekend shifts to his favorites again. Emma's jaw tightened. Lisa's pulling doubles. Again. Rick focused on smoothing the top of the popcorn bucket, keeping his tone light. "That happened a lot." Carly hesitated before nodding. "If you're on Brad's good side, you get the easy shifts. If not," she trailed off, glancing toward Lisa, who was scrubbing the soda machine with the determination of someone too tired to care. Rick exhaled slowly. Favoritism. Overworking employees without fair pay. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, and the picture was uglier than he'd expected. But he needed proof. Later that night, as the last showtimes ticked down and employees prepared for closing, Rick saw his chance. He had noticed earlier that Brad kept payroll records in his office, a careless display of arrogance. That arrogance would be his downfall. While the others locked up the lobby, Rick slipped down the dim hallway toward the manager's office. He didn't have a key, but Brad wasn't as careful as he thought. The door had been left slightly ajar. Inside, the office was cluttered with old popcorn tubs, unopened supply boxes, and a desk piled high with papers. Rick moved quickly, rifling through the stacks, until he found the payroll files. He flipped through them, his pulse quickening. There it was. A clear pattern. Employees marked in red had been consistently underpaid. Rachel's name stood out. She had confronted Brad, and days later, she was gone. The air felt thick, the silence pressing against his ears. He needed to get out before someone caught him. Just as he tucked the files back into place, a shadow passed under the door. Footsteps. Rick's stomach clenched. He barely had time to straighten before the door swung open. Brad stood in the doorway, eyes narrowing. "What the hell are you doing in here?" For a heartbeat, the room was silent. Then Rick forced a casual shrug. "Got lost. Thought this was the supply closet." Brad's gaze was sharp, calculating. "That right?" Rick met his eyes, steady. "Yeah." For a long moment, Brad didn't move. Then, with a slow, almost deliberate motion, he stepped aside. "Get out." Rick did. But as he walked back onto the theater floor, he knew one thing for certain. Brad was onto him. Lisa sat hunched over the break room table, her forehead resting against her palm, fingers gripping her temple as if trying to hold herself together. A half-eaten granola bar sat next to her, forgotten. Her other hand clutched her phone. The screen cracked, the glow of an overdue bill notification illuminating her tired face. Rick lingered in the doorway, unseen for a moment, watching as she exhaled shakily. He wasn't supposed to care this much. He was supposed to be here gathering information, confirming suspicions, ensuring that when he finally dropped the hammer, there would be no room for doubt. But Lisa wasn't just a name on a report anymore. Neither were Emma or Carly or Miguel. These people had become real to him. He cleared his throat, stepping inside. "You okay?" Lisa flinched, straightening. "Yeah, fine." She wasn't. Rick pulled out a chair, lowering himself onto it. "You sure?" For a long time, she didn't answer. Then, with a brittle laugh, she set her phone down. "You ever feel like you're stuck? Like no matter how hard you work, someone else is deciding your future?" Rick thought of his early days, long before he was a CEO, back when he was just a kid ushering moviegoers to their seats. He thought of the hours he had put in, believing that if he worked hard enough, he could carve out something better. "Yeah," he said quietly. Lisa exhaled, shaking her head. "I need this job. I take care of my little brother, and our rent just went up. But Brad, he keeps cutting my hours on paper and forcing me to stay late without clocking in. Says it's part of the team effort." She gave a hollow chuckle. Team effort. Funny, right? Rick clenched his fists beneath the table. It wasn't funny. It was illegal. "Have you told anyone?" he asked. Lisa scoffed. "Who? Corporate? You think they care? I sent an email once. Got no response. Brad made it clear that if I push, I'll lose everything." Rick's jaw tightened. This wasn't a case of simple mismanagement. It was calculated abuse. Before he could respond, the break room door swung open. Brad. His gaze flickered between them, settling on Lisa, then Rick. A slow, knowing smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Break time's over, sweetheart," he said, voice slick with condescension. "Why don't you get back to actually earning that paycheck you love so much?" Lisa's face flushed, but she stood without a word. Rick stayed seated, forcing himself to meet Brad's stare with blank indifference. Brad's smirk widened. "Something wrong, new guy?" Rick shrugged. "Just observing." Brad leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "Yeah? And what exactly are you observing?" Rick didn't blink. "How you run this place." Brad let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "That's so? Well, let me give you a piece of advice, Greg. Don't stick your nose where it doesn't belong." A warning. Rick smiled faintly. "Appreciate the advice." Brad's eyes darkened, his smirk fading. Without another word, he turned and left. Rick exhaled slowly. He had what he needed. But now, he wanted more than justice. He wanted Brad to know exactly who he had underestimated. And he wanted to watch him fall. The theater buzzed with the usual late afternoon rush. Teenagers loitering near the arcade. Families herding kids toward the latest animated film. A couple bickering over which overpriced combo to buy. But beneath the surface, something was different. The employees moved with an odd energy, a mixture of unease and anticipation, like they could sense an oncoming storm, but didn't know which way it would break. Rick stood behind the concession counter, hands steady as he filled a soda cup, but inside, adrenaline surged through him. This was it, the final act. He had spent days gathering proof, listening to whispered stories, watching how fear shaped the way these employees carried themselves. It all led here. Brad emerged from his office, expression smug as he surveyed his domain. He thrived on control, on the quiet knowledge that everyone beneath him was too afraid to challenge him. That was about to change. Lisa caught Rick's eye from across the room. She didn't know the full truth yet, no one did, but she could sense something was coming. She'd been afraid for too long. Now, there was something else in her gaze. Hope. Rick set the soda down, stepped out from behind the counter, and walked straight toward Brad. Brad. His voice carried, cutting through the chatter of customers and employees alike. Conversations slowed. Heads turned. Brad raised a brow, clearly amused by the audacity. "Something you need, Greg?" Rick pulled off his name tag and let it drop to the floor. "Yeah, actually I do." And then, with the ease of a man slipping back into his rightful place, he straightened his shoulders, lifted his chin, and spoke in the voice that had built an empire. "My name is Richard Holloway. I own this company." A ripple of shock spread through the room. Lisa sucked in a breath. Emma and Carly exchanged wide-eyed stares. Even Miguel, who had spent most of his shifts trying to be invisible, looked up in stunned disbelief. Brad, to his credit, didn't falter immediately. His smirk flickered, but didn't fully disappear. "That's a cute story," he said, voice even. "But I don't have time for jokes." Rick smiled, sharp knowing. "No joke. And I've spent the last week watching you steal from my employees, intimidate them, humiliate them. You've taken advantage of your position, thinking no one would hold you accountable." He took a step closer. "You were wrong." Brad's composure finally cracked. His expression twisted, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape route. This is ridiculous," he sputtered. "You can't prove anything." Rick reached into his pocket, pulling out a folded document. Payroll discrepancies. Records of unpaid wages. Employee statements. "I have enough to not only fire you, but ensure you never work in this industry again." The room was dead silent. Every employee stood frozen, waiting, barely daring to breathe. Brad's face darkened, his bravado crumbling. "You think you can just walk in here and—" Rick cut him off. "I don't think. I know." He signaled to a security officer who had arrived moments earlier, alerted by corporate at Rick's request. "You're done here." For the first time since Rick had stepped into this theater, Brad looked powerless. He sputtered, raged, but the reality settled in quickly. There was no saving himself. As security escorted him out, Rick turned back to the employees. Their faces were a mix of disbelief and something else, relief. Lisa stepped forward, still cautious, still uncertain. Is this real?" Rick met her gaze. "Yes. And I promise you, things are going to change." And for the first time since he had walked into this theater, Lisa smiled. A real, unguarded smile. By the time the evening crowd rolled in, the air felt lighter. The weight that had pressed down on these employees for so long had lifted. Rick stayed long enough to make sure every mistreated employee was taken care of, Lisa's missing wages, Miguel's rightful hours, Emma and Carly's fair schedules. He spoke to them as people, not numbers on a corporate sheet. Before he left, he pulled Emma and Carly aside. "I heard you both love movies," he said. "Ever thought about making them?" Carly blinked. "Well, yeah, it's kind of a dream." Rick smiled. "Good. Because I'm offering you both scholarships to film school. You stood up for what was right. That kind of courage deserves to be rewarded." Emma made a sound between a gasp and a laugh. Carly covered her mouth in shock. "Are you serious?" Rick nodded. Completely. As he walked out of the theater that night, stepping into the cool evening air, he took one last look at the glowing marquee. This wasn't just about business. It was about people. And he had no intention of forgetting that again.